Mara's newborn daughter had never made a sound in 3 weeks of life until the Vampire King stepped into the hospital room. The baby's eyes snapped open for the first time, locking onto his ancient gaze. What no one knew was that silence meant she was waiting, and her first recognition would bind two worlds in ways that could destroy them both. Mara Blackthorn's fingers traced the edge of Luna's blanket for the thousandth time that morning, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall with mechanical precision that seemed too measured for a newborn. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the private room where she had spent 21 days waiting for a sound that never came. Luna lay perfectly still in her arms, porcelain skin cool to the touch, tiny fists never clenching, dark lashes resting against cheeks that never flushed with the effort of crying. The silence wrapped around them like a shroud, broken only by the steady beeping of monitors that tracked a heartbeat following rhythms no pediatric textbook could explain. Dr. Sarah Chen had run every test imaginable, her usually confident demeanor cracking with each normal result that failed to explain the abnormal child. Mara shifted position, feeling the weight of Luna's stillness against her chest, remembering how other mothers complained about sleepless nights and endless crying, while she would have given anything to hear her daughter make a single sound. The hospital staff moved past their doorway in purposeful silence, voices dropping to whispers when they thought Mara couldn't hear their speculation about the baby, who breathed but never lived, who ate but never demanded, who slept but never truly woke. Elena Blackthorn sat in the corner chair, her weathered hands working worry beads that clicked with nervous rhythm as she studied her granddaughter with eyes that held ancient knowledge. She had arrived the day after Luna's birth, taking one look at the child before pulling Mara aside to whisper about family history that sounded more like folklore than fact. Stories of quiet children born when the moon turned red, babies who waited for something beyond human understanding, bloodlines that carried secrets older than recorded memory. Mara had dismissed her mother's tales as grief-induced fantasy, but now, watching Luna's eerily perfect stillness, she found herself remembering every detail with growing unease. Dr. Chen entered with her usual collection of charts and clipboards, her professional smile failing to reach eyes that held genuine concern. She had become a fixture in their lives, arriving each morning with new tests to run and theories to explore, each one leading nowhere. The neurological scans showed perfect brain activity, the blood work revealed nothing unusual, and the reflexes tested within normal ranges, yet Luna remained locked in a state that defied medical explanation. Chen sat on the edge of the bed, her voice carefully modulated to hide the frustration that Mara could see building behind her composed exterior. They discussed feeding schedules and developmental milestones, words that felt meaningless when applied to a child who showed no interest in the world around her. Other babies in the ward cried for attention, reached for faces, tracked movements with curious eyes. But Luna existed in a bubble of profound stillness that unnerved even the most experienced nurses. As evening approached and visiting hours ended, Mara found herself alone with Luna once again, watching the way her daughter's breathing seemed to deepen as darkness fell outside their window. The hospital transformed at night, becoming a place of shadows and whispered conversations where strange things felt possible in ways they never did during the bright efficiency of daytime hours. Luna's temperature always dropped several degrees after sunset, her skin taking on an almost translucent quality that made the blue veins beneath visible like delicate lace patterns. The monitors registered these changes without alarm, programmed to accept variations that would have triggered alerts in any other infant. Elena had mentioned blood moons and waiting children, words that echoed in Mara's mind as she held her daughter close and wondered what Luna might be waiting for in the depths of her mysterious silence. The corridors of Mercy General Hospital stretched before Victor Dracul like arteries in a body he had learned to navigate over centuries of existence, his footsteps silent against polished floors that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting. He wore the persona of Dr. Vincent Draven with practiced ease, the white coat and identification badge lending credibility to his presence, while concealing the predatory grace that marked his true nature. The supernatural energy he had detected 3 nights ago pulsed stronger now, drawing him toward the maternity ward with an urgency that stirred instincts dormant for decades. Other vampires might have dismissed the sensation as wishful thinking, but Victor had survived a millennium by trusting impressions that defied logical explanation. The scent hit him first, something beyond human detection, but unmistakable to his enhanced senses. The metallic tang of ancient bloodlines mixed with the sterile cleanliness of modern medicine. Nurses moved past him with tired efficiency, their 12-hour shifts wearing down defenses that might otherwise question a specialist they had never seen before making rounds in their ward. Victor had perfected the art of blending into human institutions, using glamour and suggestion to smooth his passage through bureaucratic obstacles that would have trapped lesser supernatural beings. His documentation appeared flawless to anyone who checked, his credentials verified by systems that bent to his will with centuries of practice behind the manipulation. The energy signature grew stronger as he approached the private rooms, emanating from a source that made his dead heart attempt a beat for the first time in decades. He paused outside room 314, feeling power radiating through the walls in waves that spoke of possibilities he had thought lost forever to the brutal realities of vampire politics and human ignorance. The door opened silently under his touch, revealing a scene that stopped him cold, despite all his preparation and expectations. Mara Blackthorne sat by the window, her dark hair catching moonlight as she cradled a child who radiated the unmistakable presence of dormant vampire nobility. Victor had seen ancient bloodlines before, had even possessed artifacts that carried similar energy signatures, but never in a living being who bore the marks of both human and supernatural heritage. Luna lay perfectly still in her mother's arms, her small form seeming to draw shadows toward her like a magnet pulling iron filings into recognizable patterns. The moment Victor crossed the threshold, reality shifted around them with the weight of prophecy becoming manifest. Luna's eyes opened for the first time in 3 weeks of life, revealing irises that shifted from warm brown to liquid silver as they focused on his face with recognition that transcended her infant state. The sound that emerged from Luna's throat was not the wail that had been absent since her birth, but a soft humming that seemed to resonate with frequencies beyond human hearing. Every piece of glass in the room began to vibrate in harmony with her voice, the water pitcher on the bedside table creating ripples in perfect concentric circles, while the window overlooking the parking lot sang with crystalline notes that would have shattered under more pressure. Victor staggered backward, his supernatural composure cracking as he recognized the bloodline he had helped destroy centuries ago in a war that defined the modern relationship between vampires and humans. Mara gasped, clutching Luna closer as her daughter's first sound filled the space between them with music that belonged to another age entirely. The baby's gaze never wavered from Victor's face, as if she had been waiting specifically for this moment, this recognition, this connection that would change everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between species. The immediate aftermath of Luna's awakening sent ripples through the hospital that no amount of medical training could explain or contain. Equipment throughout the maternity ward began experiencing inexplicable malfunctions, monitors displaying readings that fluctuated between normal and impossible, while security cameras captured footage of shadows that moved independently of their sources. Other newborns in the nursery grew restless for the first time since Luna's arrival, their cries filling spaces that had been unusually quiet for weeks, as if her silence had somehow affected the entire ward. Victor attempted to back toward the door, every instinct screaming at him to flee before the implications of this discovery spread beyond the confines of this single room, but found his legs refusing to obey commands that had never failed him in 1,000 years of existence. An invisible tether stretched between him and the child, binding them together with threads of ancient magic that pulsed with each beat of Luna's too slow heart. Mara stared at the stranger, who had somehow awakened her daughter from her mysterious trance, terror and relief warring in her expression as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. Victor forced himself to remain calm, drawing on centuries of experience in managing supernatural crises while trying to understand the scope of what Luna's awakening meant for both their species. He could feel the pull growing stronger, an inexorable connection that made leaving impossible, even as his rational mind catalogued the dangers of remaining. The child in Mara's arms continued her soft humming, the sound weaving patterns in the air that spoke to parts of Victor's memory he had thought buried beyond recovery. Luna's eyes tracked his movements with awareness that seemed far beyond her chronological age, silver irises holding depths of knowledge that should not have existed in any newborn, supernatural or otherwise. With careful words chosen to avoid triggering panic, Victor began explaining the impossible truth that Luna's awakening had revealed to anyone with the supernatural senses to perceive it. She carried the bloodline of the Umbral Court, vampire royalty that had ruled during an age when humans and the undead lived in careful balance rather than the modern state of mutual ignorance and fear. The genocide that ended that golden age had supposedly eliminated every trace of hybrid heritage, yet here sat living proof that the ancient bloodlines had merely gone dormant, waiting for the right catalyst to awaken dormant abilities. Luna's silence had not been absence but preparation, her body gathering supernatural energy until a true blood vampire could unlock the heritage that flowed through her veins. Now that the connection had been established, prophecies that Victor had dismissed as wishful thinking began manifesting around them with consequences that would ripple through both human and vampire societies. The binding between Victor and Luna grew stronger with each passing moment, supernatural forces beyond either of their controls weaving them together in ways that made separation impossible. He tried to explain to Mara that her daughter represented either the greatest hope for peace between their species, or the catalyst for a war that would make their historical conflicts seem like minor disagreements. Luna's hybrid nature gave her the potential to bridge worlds that had been separated by centuries of mistrust and violence, but that same power could just as easily destroy both sides if not properly guided and protected. As Luna's humming gradually faded to contented silence, her eyes slowly closing as if the effort of awakening had exhausted reserves, she would need time to rebuild. Victor realized that his lonely existence as Vampire King had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous than anything he had faced in a millennium of supernatural politics and ancient grudges. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Victor's voice carried the weight of centuries as he began unraveling the truth that would shatter everything Mara thought she knew about her family's history. His words measured and careful as he watched her face for signs that the revelations might break her fragile grip on a reality already twisted beyond recognition. The hospital room seemed to shrink around them as he spoke of times when vampires walked openly among humans, not as predators hiding in shadows, but as partners in a delicate balance that had sustained both species for generations uncounted. Seraphina Blackthorn had been more than just Mara's ancestor. She had been an oracle whose visions guided both human and vampire rulers through the treacherous politics of the medieval world, her gifts allowing her to see paths through conflicts that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. Victor's great-uncle Alaric had fallen in love with Seraphina, despite laws that forbade such unions, their passion creating something unprecedented in the supernatural world. Children who carried the best traits of both species, while being bound by the limitations of neither. The candlelit crypts beneath the ancient castle where Victor had spent his youth flickered in his memory as he described the golden age that followed Seraphina and Alaric's union, when hybrid children grew to adulthood with abilities that amazed even the eldest vampires and wisest human mages. These beings could walk in sunlight without burning, their vampire strength and speed undiminished by the deadly rays that confined their pure-blood cousins to darkness, while retaining human capacity for growth and change that made them natural diplomats between worlds that had known only suspicion and fear. They commanded respect from both living and undead, their presence at negotiations ensuring that agreements reached would be honored by all parties. Their very existence proof that cooperation was not only possible, but profitable for everyone involved. The scent of ancient parchment filled Victor's nostrils as he remembered studying the treaties and trade agreements that had flourished during those brief decades when hybrids served as bridges between human kingdoms and vampire courts, their unique nature making them trusted by all and feared by none. But fear had eventually poisoned the Golden Age, as it always did when power shifted too quickly for entrenched interests to adapt, and the Vampire Council began to see the hybrids not as bridges, but as threats to the natural order that had sustained vampire civilization for millennia. Countess Elisara Vex, even then ambitious and ruthless despite her relative youth, had whispered poison into the ears of elder vampires who remembered when humans were prey rather than partners, convincing them that hybrid children would eventually replace pure-blood vampires entirely if allowed to continue breeding and growing in power. The weight of silver chains had pressed against Victor's wrists as he was forced to watch the systematic hunting of every hybrid child, their unique abilities making them easy to track but difficult to kill, each death diminishing the hope for lasting peace between species that had taken centuries to build. Seraphina herself had been the final target, her execution a message that even the most beloved oracle could not protect those who dared to bridge the gap between human and vampire worlds, her screams echoing through the castle dungeons where Victor had been chained to prevent his interference. One child had escaped the genocide, a daughter barely old enough to walk, who had been spirited away by human allies, who understood that her death would end any hope of future reconciliation between their peoples, and Victor had spent centuries believing that this single survivor had died childless and alone, the hybrid bloodline extinct forever. The dormant genes had passed through generations of Blackthorn descendants, hidden so deeply that even the most sensitive supernatural beings could not detect them, waiting for the precise combination of circumstances that would allow them to manifest once again in a child born under the blood moon that marked the anniversary of Seraphina's death. Luna represented not just the return of the hybrid bloodline, but the potential fulfillment of prophecies that spoke of a child who would either unite the warring species or destroy them both. Her very existence, a challenge to the carefully maintained balance of power that had kept vampires and humans separated for 6 centuries. Mara's hands trembled as she absorbed the implications of Victor's revelations, her mind struggling to process the idea that her quiet daughter carried the genetic legacy of beings who had once shaped the fate of 2 worlds, the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like a mountain of expectations she was utterly unprepared to bear. The hospital room felt suddenly fragile around them, a bubble of modern medicine and sterile safety that could be popped by forces beyond anything she had ever imagined. And she found herself looking at Luna with new eyes that saw not just her beloved child, but the living embodiment of hopes and fears that had driven supernatural politics for longer than human civilization had existed. Victor's presence beside her no longer felt like an intrusion, but like a lifeline to a world she was only beginning to understand. His ancient knowledge the only thing standing between her daughter and the same fate that had befallen Seraphina's other children centuries ago. Word of Luna's awakening spread through supernatural networks with the speed that only truly significant events could achieve, carried by vampires who had felt the psychic disturbance of her first cry, and confirmed by mystics who had long watched for signs that the ancient prophecies might finally be fulfilled. In a conference room deep beneath the streets of Prague, where the Vampire Council had maintained its headquarters since fleeing the New World's revolutionary wars, Countess Elisara Vex studied reports that made her aristocratic features harden with the cold fury of someone whose carefully laid plans were being threatened by circumstances beyond her control. The polished obsidian table reflected the faces of council members who had survived centuries by eliminating threats before they could fully manifest, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright terror as they debated what response the hybrid child's existence demanded from their ancient institution. Elisara's voice cut through their discussions like a blade through silk, her words carrying the authority of someone who had orchestrated the original genocide and would not hesitate to repeat it if necessary to preserve vampire supremacy over the supernatural world. The sterile corridors of a government facility hidden beneath the mountains of Colorado buzzed with similar activity as Agent Marcus Thorne studied satellite imagery and energy readings that defied every scientific explanation his team could provide, his weathered face showing no emotion despite the recognition that burned in his eyes as he identified his supposedly dead sister in the hospital surveillance footage. Marcus had faked his death 5 years ago to escape a vampire attack that had killed their parents and left him with scars both physical and psychological. His recruitment into a covert paranormal division, providing the resources and training he needed to wage war against the creatures he blamed for destroying his family. The high-tech bunker around him hummed with equipment designed to detect and neutralize supernatural threats. Every screen and sensor array focused on the energy signature that had erupted from Mercy General Hospital, like a beacon calling to every supernatural being within a 1,000-mile radius. Both factions saw Luna as either a weapon to be controlled or a threat to be eliminated, their responses shaped by centuries of conflict that had taught them to view any significant change in the supernatural balance as a prelude to war. And neither side showed any interest in considering that a hybrid child might represent hope for peace rather than a catalyst for destruction. The Vampire Council's debate centered on whether Luna should be captured for study or killed immediately to prevent her powers from fully developing, while the human operatives planned extraction scenarios that assumed her vampire nature made her inherently dangerous to civilian populations. Victor realized with growing alarm that both groups would soon converge on the hospital where Mara and Luna remained vulnerable. Their protective instincts no match for forces that commanded resources and experience far beyond anything a single vampire could oppose, no matter how ancient or powerful he might be. The council chamber's ancient stones seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as Elisara outlined her strategy for dealing with the hybrid threat, her voice never rising above a cultured whisper that somehow carried more menace than the loudest roar of rage could have conveyed. She had survived the original purge by being more ruthless than her enemies and more paranoid than her allies, qualities that had served her well during the subsequent centuries of vampire politics, where weakness was death and sentiment was luxury only the truly powerful could afford. The other council members listened with the attention that self-preservation demanded, knowing that opposing Elisara's will was a form of suicide that even immortal beings rarely chose to embrace, her network of spies and assassins making disagreement a terminal condition for anyone foolish enough to voice it openly. Marcus studied the tactical displays that covered every surface of the operations center, his team of specialists preparing equipment that could theoretically contain or neutralize supernatural beings, while privately acknowledging that their previous encounters with vampires had ended in casualties that Command preferred to classify as training accidents rather than mission failures. The government's paranormal division existed in a state of constant preparation for threats they only partially understood, their technology advanced, but their actual combat experience limited to creatures far less powerful than the ancient beings that Luna's awakening had attracted to their attention. Marcus knew that his personal connection to the target complicated his objectivity, but his hatred for vampires ran deep enough to override any familial concerns that might interfere with his duty to protect humanity from supernatural threats that most people never knew existed. The assassins arrived at Mercy General Hospital disguised as night shift nursing staff, their forged credentials and carefully practiced mannerisms allowing them to blend seamlessly into the institutional hierarchy that governed modern medical facilities, while their supernatural abilities remained hidden beneath layers of human appearance that would have fooled anyone without Victor's ancient experience in detecting deception. The neonatal unit became a battlefield when Victor's enhanced senses detected the killers moving through corridors that had become as familiar to him as his own castle had once been, his protective instincts overriding centuries of careful control as he realized that Luna and Mara were about to face the same fate that had claimed Serafina and her children so long ago. His supernatural speed allowed him to intercept the first assassin before the vampire could reach Luna's room, their collision sending both figures crashing through walls that crumbled like paper under the impact of their struggle, while other patients and staff scrambled for safety from violence that exceeded anything their emergency protocols had prepared them to handle. The battle that followed transformed the sterile medical environment into a war zone where furniture became weapons and medical equipment exploded in showers of sparks that illuminated combatants moving with inhuman grace and deadly precision. Victor's experience and desperation, allowing him to hold his own against opponents who had been chosen specifically for their skill at eliminating supernatural targets. Blood splattered across pristine white walls as claws and fangs found their marks. The scent of spilled vitae mixing with the antiseptic smell of hospital disinfectant to create an odor that spoke of violence in places meant for healing, while Mara clutched Luna to her chest and tried to find shelter in a room that offered no protection from forces beyond human comprehension. Victor's defensive strategy focused on preventing the assassins from reaching the infant who represented either salvation or damnation for both their species, his ancient body absorbing damage that would have killed lesser beings, while dealing out punishment that reduced furniture to splinters and medical equipment to twisted metal. Luna's power manifested at the moment when Victor's defenses finally began to falter under the coordinated assault of enemies who had been planning this attack for decades, her infant lungs producing a cry that shattered every window in the hospital's east wing and sent psychic shockwaves racing outward like ripples in a pond, disturbed by a falling boulder. The sound carried frequencies that human ears could not detect, but vampire nervous systems could not ignore, overloading supernatural senses with feedback that left both attackers and defender unconscious on floors suddenly carpeted with broken glass that caught moonlight streaming through empty window frames. In the aftermath of Luna's cry, as emergency alarms wailed and staff struggled to understand what had happened to their previously quiet patient, Mara realized that her life as a nurse in a peaceful hospital had ended forever, replaced by something larger and more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined possible. Victor recovered consciousness first, his ancient constitution allowing him to shake off the psychic assault that had incapacitated younger vampires, and he gathered Mara and Luna in arms that still trembled from the supernatural feedback, while explaining that they had perhaps minutes before more enemies arrived to finish what the assassins had started. The hospital erupted in controlled chaos as administrators tried to explain a gas leak explosion that had somehow managed to shatter windows without producing any actual explosion. Their cover story falling apart under the scrutiny of investigators who found evidence of violence that no gas leak could have produced, while Victor led his makeshift family through corridors filled with broken glass that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the emergency lighting that had replaced the shattered fluorescent fixtures throughout the damaged wing. The ancient tunnels beneath the city stretched endlessly before them, as Victor led Mara and Luna through passages that had been carved from living rock centuries before the modern metropolis above had even been conceived, the vampires' knowledge of these forgotten arteries proving invaluable as they fled the chaos erupting behind them at Mercy General Hospital. Water dripped steadily from limestone walls that bore the marks of craftsmen who had worked by torchlight to create these hidden highways, their tools leaving patterns that caught the faint illumination from Victor's phone as he navigated turns and intersections that would have been impossible for human memory to retain across the decades he had been using them. Mara clutched Luna against her chest, feeling her daughter's breathing remain steady, despite the supernatural exertion that had shattered windows throughout an entire hospital wing, while her own heart hammered with the adrenaline of someone whose world had been permanently altered by forces she was only beginning to understand. The tunnels carried scents of age and secrets, moldering stone mixed with the metallic tang of old water pipes, and the distant aroma of candle wax that suggested their destination lay somewhere ahead in the maze of forgotten infrastructure. Victor's sanctuary emerged from the darkness like something from a fever dream. The abandoned Gothic cathedral rising from the tunnel system through a concealed entrance that opened into the building's ancient crypt, where stone effigies of long-dead nobles watched their passage with marble eyes that seemed to track movement in the flickering candlelight. The cathedral itself soared above them in magnificent decay, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows that dance with the light of hundreds of candles Victor had arranged throughout the space over the years, creating an atmosphere that balanced sacred beauty with the practical needs of someone who required sanctuary from a world that would destroy him if his true nature were discovered. Stained glass windows filtered moonlight into pools of colored illumination that painted the worn stone floors with patterns of blue and gold and crimson, while ancient artifacts collected over Victor's long existence filled alcoves and corners with the accumulated treasures of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. Mara found herself overwhelmed by the transition from sterile hospital corridors to this space that breathed with the weight of centuries, her nursing training providing no context for caring for an infant whose supernatural nature was becoming more apparent with each passing hour. Luna alternated between periods of normal infant behavior, crying softly when hungry or uncomfortable, and moments of eerie awareness where her eyes shifted to that unsettling silver color and she seemed to study her surroundings with intelligence far beyond her chronological age. Victor attempted to explain the basics of vampire lore and protection spells, his voice echoing softly in the vast space as he taught Mara how to recognize supernatural threats and defend against them, using techniques that had been refined over millennia of conflict between species. The lessons proved challenging not only because of their supernatural complexity, but also due to the growing attraction that sparked between teacher and student whenever their hands touched during demonstrations of protective gestures, or their eyes met across the candlelit space where shadows played tricks that made every interaction feel charged with possibilities. Neither was quite ready to acknowledge. The cathedral's atmosphere seemed to soothe Luna in ways that the hospital's clinical environment never had, her tiny form relaxing into peaceful sleep against the stone floors worn smooth by countless generations of worshippers whose feet had traced paths between altar and nave, confessional and chapel, in rituals that had sanctified this space long before Victor claimed it as his refuge. Victor explained that the building's consecrated nature provided natural protection against certain types of supernatural attack, while its abandoned status meant they could remain hidden from both vampire politics and human surveillance as long as they maintained the careful balance between visibility and secrecy that had kept him alive through centuries of conflict. He showed Mara how to light the candles in patterns that would strengthen the cathedral's protective properties, how to prepare the simple foods that Luna would need as she grew, and how to recognize the signs that would indicate whether her daughter's hybrid nature was developing in ways that might threaten her safety or the safety of those around her. The teaching sessions stretched through the night hours when Victor felt most comfortable, his vampiric nature making him naturally nocturnal, while Mara struggled to adjust her human sleep patterns to accommodate their new reality. The exhaustion of recent events warring with the adrenaline of learning skills she had never imagined she would need. Victor's proximity during their lessons filled the air between them with tension that had nothing to do with supernatural threats and everything to do with the way candlelight played across his ancient features, revealing glimpses of the man he had been before centuries of isolation and responsibility had hardened him into the creature who now risked everything to protect strangers whose fate had become entangled with his own. Mara found herself studying the way his hands moved when he demonstrated protective gestures, the graceful economy of motion that spoke of deadly skill wielded with careful restraint, while Victor discovered that teaching someone to survive in his world required a level of trust and intimacy he had not experienced since the Golden Age, when vampires and humans had worked together rather than merely coexisting in ignorance. Luna's responses to the cathedral environment suggested that some part of her recognized her heritage in ways that transcended conscious memory, her infant awareness somehow connecting with the spiritual energy that permeated stone walls, blessed by centuries of prayer and sanctified by the devotion of believers who had never known that their sacred space would one day shelter the very beings their mythology had taught them to fear. Victor watched the child's reactions with growing wonder, seeing in her peaceful acceptance of their refuge the possibility that hybrid nature might bridge not only the gap between human and vampire, but also the divide between sacred and profane that had complicated supernatural existence since the earliest conflicts between faith and darkness. The stained glass windows cast patterns of colored light that seemed to dance in response to Luna's presence, as if the very building acknowledged her unique nature and welcomed her as a child of both worlds whose existence validated the hope that reconciliation might be possible between species that had known only conflict for far too long. Agent Marcus Thorne's advanced detection equipment painted the cathedral district in electronic signatures that revealed supernatural activity concentrated in patterns no natural phenomenon could explain. The readings from his specialized sensors growing stronger as his team moved through streets where modern buildings stood alongside structures that predated the city's official founding by decades or even centuries. Marcus studied the data streaming across his tactical display with the focused intensity of someone whose personal vendetta had been refined by years of government training and resources that most vampire hunters could never access. His hatred for the creatures that had destroyed his family, now backed by technology that could track supernatural beings through the electromagnetic signatures their unnatural metabolisms produced. The equipment his team carried represented the cutting edge of paranormal research, devices that could detect vampiric presence through everything from thermal anomalies to psychic disturbances, while his own experience hunting the undead provided the tactical knowledge necessary to turn scientific advantage into lethal effectiveness. The storm gathering overhead seemed to respond to the tensions building in the cathedral district as Marcus closed in on the sanctuary where his supposedly dead sister had taken refuge with the vampire responsible for turning her life upside down. Lightning flickering between clouds that hung heavy with rain, just waiting for the right moment to unleash the deluge that would transform empty streets into rivers running towards storm drains that connected to the same tunnel system Victor had used to spirit his charges away from the hospital. Marcus felt the familiar mixture of rage and anticipation that always preceded his encounters with vampires. The combination of emotions that had sustained him through 5 years of hunting creatures whose very existence mocked everything he had believed about the natural order before their fangs had torn his family apart and left him with scars that ached whenever the weather changed. His team moved with military precision through streets that seemed deserted, but which Marcus knew were probably under observation by supernatural entities whose senses far exceeded anything human technology could match. Their approach calculated to appear routine while positioning them for the kind of assault that had eliminated vampire covens from New York to Los Angeles. The cathedral's ancient doors opened with a groan of hinges that had not been properly maintained since the building's abandonment decades earlier, admitting Marcus and his tactical team into the sacred space where Victor had been teaching Mara the basics of survival in a world where her daughter's heritage made them targets for forces that recognized no sanctuary as inviolate. The reunion between siblings crackled with emotions too complex for either of them to process fully. Mara's joy at discovering her brother alive, warring with horror at the realization that his survival had come at the cost of becoming something cold and ruthless enough to hunt sentient beings with the same methodical efficiency he had once applied to more conventional military targets. Marcus looked older than his years, his face bearing scars both visible and hidden from encounters with creatures whose claws and fangs left marks that never properly healed, while his eyes held the flat hardness of someone who had seen too much darkness to believe in redemption for any being whose nature placed them outside the boundaries of human mortality. Victor stepped protectively between Marcus and the alcove where Luna slept in her makeshift crib, his ancient instincts recognizing the trained killer beneath Marcus's human appearance, while also sensing the family connection that complicated what should have been a straightforward confrontation between predator and prey. Marcus refused to accept Victor's claims of peaceful intentions, his experience with vampires having taught him that their kind excelled at manipulation and deception, while the sight of Luna filled him with revulsion that had nothing to do with her infant innocence and everything to do with the hybrid nature that made her an abomination in his worldview, shaped by years of seeing vampiric cruelty firsthand. The three-way standoff that developed in the cathedral's nave played out against the backdrop of storm clouds gathering outside, rain beginning to drum against stained glass windows while lightning illuminated the soaring architecture that had witnessed centuries of human drama, but never anything quite like the confrontation unfolding beneath its consecrated arches. Mara found herself caught between the brother she had mourned and the vampire who had protected her family, her loyalties torn by competing claims on her affection and trust, while Luna remained blissfully unaware of the tensions threatening to tear apart the fragile alliance that had kept them safe since fleeing the hospital. Marcus demanded that she surrender Luna for government study, that he claimed would unlock the secrets of vampire-human hybridization for the benefit of humanity, while Victor insisted that such study would inevitably lead to experimentation that would destroy the child's humanity while learning nothing that could actually help either species. The debate grew more heated as rain intensified outside, and the cathedral's protective atmosphere seemed to thicken with supernatural energy, responding to the conflicts playing out within its walls. Each participant convinced that their position represented the only hope for preventing catastrophe, while simultaneously creating the conditions that might trigger the very disaster they sought to avoid. The temperature in the cathedral dropped precipitously as Countess Elisara arrived with a war party that materialized from shadows that had seemed empty moments before. Her presence announced by the way candlelight flickered and dimmed, as if supernatural darkness were actively consuming the illumination that had made the space feel safe and sacred. Victor's ancient enemy moved with the predatory grace of someone who had perfected the art of killing over centuries of practice. Her aristocratic features beautiful in the same way that a perfectly crafted blade was beautiful, while her eyes held depths of cruelty that made Marcus's hatred seem like a child's tantrum by comparison. She offered Victor the choice between surrendering Luna for what she termed a humane death, or watching both mother and child suffer prolonged torment before their inevitable execution, her voice carrying the cultured tones of European nobility mixed with undertones of menace that made every word sound like a threat wrapped in silk. The battle that erupted when Victor rejected her ultimatum transformed the cathedral from sanctuary to battleground, centuries of accumulated artifacts and furniture exploding into splinters and fragments as supernatural forces collided with violence that exceeded anything the ancient building had witnessed during its long existence. Marcus found his hatred for vampires complicated by the realization that Elisara's cruelty extended to innocent humans, his tactical training overriding personal prejudices as he began targeting council members who threatened Mara while she tried to protect Luna from the chaos erupting around them. Victor fought with desperate fury against opponents whose combined experience matched his own, his supernatural abilities pushed to their limits as he attempted to defend not just his own existence but the future that Luna represented for both species, while stone pillars cracked under impacts that would have leveled modern buildings. Luna's power manifested at the moment when the battle seemed lost, her infant voice producing a sonic boom that brought down sections of the cathedral's ancient roof, while her psychic scream reverberated through dimensions that most beings never perceived. The combination of physical and supernatural force, creating devastation that left all combatants stunned and bleeding among the rubble of centuries-old masonry. In the aftermath, as dust motes danced in shafts of moonlight streaming through gaps where the roof had been, Elisara gathered her surviving followers and retreated with promises that this confrontation was merely the opening move in a war that would not end until every trace of hybrid bloodline had been erased from existence. The trio of unlikely allies barely escaped through tunnels that had partially collapsed under the assault, Victor severely wounded but still functional, while Marcus grudgingly accepted that their survival depended on cooperation that transcended his personal hatred for the undead, and Mara carrying Luna through passages that led away from the ruined cathedral toward an uncertain future, where the only certainty was that nowhere would be safe for long. The ancient maps spread across Victor's makeshift desk revealed coastlines that had changed little since medieval cartographers first traced their boundaries with instruments that measured both physical distance and supernatural resonance. Their faded ink marking locations where the boundaries between worlds grew thin enough for beings like Madame Zelda to establish sanctuaries that existed partially outside normal reality. Victor's finger traced the route that would take them through abandoned towns and fog-shrouded highways toward a lighthouse that appeared on no modern navigation system, but which had guided supernatural travelers for centuries. Its beacon powered not by electricity, but by crystalline formations that amplified and focused the psychic energies that flowed like invisible rivers through the landscape. Mara held Luna against her chest as they prepared for the journey, feeling her daughter's weight increase with each passing day, as the hybrid child's accelerated development began manifesting in ways that defied every pediatric textbook ever written, while Marcus checked weapons and equipment with the methodical precision of someone whose survival had always depended on being prepared for encounters that most humans would dismiss as impossible nightmares. The drive through countryside that seemed frozen in perpetual twilight took them past settlements where streetlights flickered with irregular rhythms that suggested electrical systems struggling against influences that had nothing to do with power grids or municipal infrastructure, while shadows moved independently of the objects that should have cast them, creating an atmosphere of wrongness that made even Marcus grip his weapons more tightly, despite his extensive experience with supernatural phenomena. Victor navigated roads that appeared and disappeared according to rules that owed more to ancient geography than modern engineering, his vampiric senses guiding them through a landscape where reality bent around locations of power that had been sacred long before humans learned to build permanent structures. Luna remained unusually alert during the journey, her silver eyes tracking movements that the adults couldn't perceive, while her tiny hands reached toward windows where fog swirled in patterns that seemed almost deliberately designed to conceal or reveal depending on the observer's nature and intentions. The lighthouse emerged from coastal mist like something from a fairy tale, written by someone who understood that the most powerful magic often wore the disguise of mundane utility, its whitewashed tower rising from rocky promontory, where waves crashed with the endless rhythm of tides that had beaten against these shores since before recorded history began. Madame Zelda appeared at the lighthouse door before their vehicle had fully stopped, her ancient face streaming with tears of joy as she recognized something in Luna that transcended the child's physical appearance and spoke directly to bloodlines that had been dormant for longer than most civilizations had existed. Victor felt the weight of centuries lifting from his shoulders as Zelda embraced Luna with the desperate affection of someone greeting the last member of a family she had believed extinct, while Mara experienced the strange relief of watching her daughter receive recognition from someone who understood her nature without fear or revulsion. The lighthouse interior defied architectural logic, with rooms that seemed larger than the building's external dimensions could accommodate, their walls lined with crystals that caught and refracted both natural light and supernatural energies into patterns that painted the air itself with colors that existed nowhere in the normal spectrum. Zelda moved through these spaces with the fluid grace of someone who had spent centuries learning to work with forces that most beings could barely perceive, her every gesture causing the crystals to pulse with responses that created a symphony of light and energy that spoke to parts of Luna's consciousness that were only beginning to awaken to their true potential. Victor found himself remembering fragments of the Golden Age when such places had been common rather than hidden refuges, while Marcus struggled to process an environment where his technological sensors registered reading that his scientific training insisted were impossible. Zelda's explanation of Luna's significance unfolded like a revelation that recontextualized everything they thought they understood about the child's nature and destiny, her words carrying the weight of prophecies that had been preserved through oral tradition by descendants of Seraphina, who had spent generations preparing for this moment when the hybrid bloodline would manifest once again in a child capable of bridging worlds that had grown so far apart that most beings from either side could no longer imagine peaceful coexistence. Luna represented not just the return of abilities that had been lost during the genocide centuries ago, but the potential fulfillment of predictions that spoke of a choice between healing and destruction, unity and annihilation, that would determine the fate of both human and vampire civilizations for generations to come. The lighthouse crystals seemed to pulse in harmony with Zelda's words, their resonance creating harmonics that filled the space with energy that felt simultaneously ancient and newly born, while Luna responded to the vibrations with contentment that suggested she recognized something familiar in their frequency. Under Zelda's patient guidance, Mara began developing the psychic connection with her daughter that their shared bloodline made possible, learning to perceive the thoughts and emotions that flickered through Luna's rapidly developing consciousness like lights reflected in deep water. The training sessions required Mara to unlearn everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between individual minds, accepting that her relationship with Luna transcended normal parent-child bonds, and entered territory where their thoughts could merge and separate with fluid ease that would have been terrifying if it hadn't felt so completely natural. Victor found himself relearning defensive techniques he had neglected during centuries of relying primarily on physical prowess and political maneuvering, his ancient mind struggling to recapture magical skills that had atrophied from disuse while adapting them to threats that were evolving far more rapidly than traditional vampire society could accommodate. Marcus watched these developments with the conflicted emotions of someone whose worldview was being systematically dismantled by evidence that contradicted everything his training and experience had taught him about vampire nature and supernatural threats. He observed Victor's genuine affection for Mara and protective instincts toward Luna, with growing confusion that challenged assumptions about vampiric psychology that had sustained his hatred for years. While witnessing the obvious care that both Victor and Zelda showed for the child's welfare, despite their supernatural natures that should have made them natural predators rather than guardians. The lighthouse became a crucible where former enemies learned to work together, not because they had resolved their fundamental differences, but because Luna's safety required cooperation that transcended personal prejudices and historical grievances. Luna's development accelerated beyond anything that medical science would have considered possible, her physical growth keeping pace with cognitive advancement that allowed her to begin walking at an age when most infants were still learning to hold their heads steady, while her eyes shifted through color spectrums that reflected her emotional states with chromatic precision that revealed her inner life to anyone who knew how to interpret the signals. Her supernatural senses manifested as an uncanny ability to detect other supernatural beings long before they came within range of normal perception. Her infant awareness, somehow processing information about the nature and intentions of creatures that approached their refuge with accuracy, that impressed even Zelda's centuries of experience. The training sessions that filled their days left visible marks on the lighthouse itself. Meditation circles drawn in salt that sparkled with residual energy long after the rituals ended. Protective wards that cast shadows like frozen starlight across ancient stone walls. And combat practice areas where scorch marks testified to the power that Luna was learning to control rather than simply unleash. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below provided constant accompaniment to their activities, the ocean's primal rhythm serving as a reminder of forces that existed beyond supernatural politics and human ambition. While the lighthouse beacon continued its ancient function of guiding travelers through treacherous waters, both literal and metaphorical. Victor found unexpected peace in the routine of training and study, his vampiric nature adapting to daylight hours spent learning alongside humans who no longer feared him as a monster, but accepted him as a necessary ally in protecting something precious beyond individual survival. Zelda's presence anchored their makeshift community with wisdom that came from having survived the original genocide and maintained hope through centuries of exile, her knowledge providing context for Luna's abilities that transformed potentially terrifying manifestations of power into signs of healthy development according to standards that applied to no other being in recorded history. The attack came without the careful planning that had characterized previous council operations. announced instead by the chaotic hunger of young vampires who had learned about Luna through supernatural networks and decided that claiming her for themselves would elevate their status within vampire society, regardless of the consequences for anyone else involved in the situation. These newly turned bloodsuckers brought enthusiasm and ambition, but lacked the tactical discipline that made older vampires truly dangerous. Their assault on the lighthouse resembling a feeding frenzy more than a military operation as they scrambled over rocks made slippery by spray from waves that crashed against the promontory with increasing violence, as if the ocean itself sensed the approaching conflict. Victor met their initial charge with centuries of combat experience, while Marcus provided covering fire with weapons designed to exploit vampiric vulnerabilities. But the attackers' numbers and reckless disregard for their own safety made them difficult opponents despite their lack of skill or coordination. Luna's response to the threat surprised everyone, including herself, as protective instincts that had been developing through weeks of training suddenly coalesced into conscious action that demonstrated her hybrid nature's potential for preservation rather than destruction. The barrier of pure energy that erupted around the lighthouse burned attacking vampires without harming the humans and allied vampire within its protection. The golden light that emanated from Luna's small form, serving as both shield and weapon, that responded to her will with precision that should have required years of study to achieve. Victor watched in amazement, as the child he had sworn to protect instead protected him, her power flowing with instinctive understanding of how to neutralize threats without causing unnecessary suffering, while Mara felt through their psychic connection the effort that maintaining such control required from her daughter's still developing abilities. The battle's aftermath left the lighthouse scarred but intact, scorch marks on ancient stones testifying to forces that had been unleashed and carefully controlled rather than allowed to rage without restraint, while the attacking vampires retreated with injuries that would heal, but memories that would ensure word of Luna's protective, rather than destructive nature spread through supernatural networks that had been expecting a monster, rather than a guardian. Victor tended wounds that reminded him how vulnerable even immortal beings could be when facing opponents who combined desperation with superior numbers, while Mara comforted Luna through the exhaustion that followed her first conscious use of hybrid abilities that had performed exactly as their training had prepared her to channel them. Zelda observed the child's recovery with satisfaction that came from seeing prophecies fulfilled not through violence and destruction, but through acts of protection that suggested hope for a future where Luna's nature might bridge rather than widen the gap between species that had known only conflict for far too long. The realization that they couldn't remain hidden forever settled over their lighthouse sanctuary like fog rolling in from the ocean, carrying with it the understanding that Luna's development required more than defensive preparation and protective isolation if she were to fulfill her potential as something greater than just another powerful supernatural being whose existence threatened the status quo. Zelda's revelation of an ancient sanctuary where Luna could complete her maturation safely came with the sobering acknowledgement that reaching such a place would require confronting the full might of forces that had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy anything that challenged their control over supernatural society. While the journey itself would expose them to dangers that made their previous encounters seem like minor skirmishes, compared to the war that was building around a child whose very existence had become the focal point for conflicts that had been brewing for centuries before her birth. The mountain road to Valethorn wound through passes that had been carved from living rock by forces both natural and supernatural, each switchback revealing vistas that stretched toward horizons where ancient magic still lingered in the thin air that made every breath a conscious effort for those not adapted to such altitudes. Victor found his vampiric constitution struggling against the atmospheric pressure that seemed designed to test the resolve of any being seeking to reach the legendary citadel, his normally effortless movement becoming labored as they climbed higher into regions where the boundary between earth and sky blurred into crystalline clarity that hurt to contemplate directly. Marcus battled altitude sickness that no amount of military training had prepared him to endure, his enhanced human physiology proving inadequate against environmental conditions that challenged even supernatural beings, while Mara clutched Luna closer and worried about the effects such extreme elevation might have on her daughter's rapidly developing hybrid nature. The vehicle they had acquired in the last settlement below the tree line groaned with mechanical protest as its engine fought against air too thin to provide proper combustion, forcing them to abandon motorized transport in favor of a hiking trail that existed more as legend than mapped reality. The path itself seemed to shift and change according to rules that defied cartographic logic, ancient waymarkers appearing and disappearing based on the intentions and worthiness of those who sought passage to the citadel that had once served as a beacon of cooperation between species now locked in eternal conflict. Luna remained remarkably stable throughout the ascent, her hybrid physiology adapting to conditions that stressed her companions, while her silver eyes tracked movements among the peaks that suggested they were being watched by entities whose nature remained tantalizingly unclear. Victor's knowledge of the route came from memories that predated the Citadel's abandonment. His recollections of the Golden Age when Valthorn had been a thriving metropolis, filtering through centuries of guilt and regret, that colored every landmark they passed, with associations both beautiful and tragic. The air grew colder as they climbed, carrying scents of snow and pine, mixed with something indefinably ancient, that spoke of magic woven so deeply into the landscape that it had become part of the very stones beneath their feet. Valthorn revealed itself gradually through morning mist that clung to mountain peaks like the breath of sleeping giants. The citadel's massive walls emerging from cloud cover with the majesty of something that belonged more to myth than physical reality, yet undeniably solid beneath hands that touched stone blocks fitted together with precision that modern engineering could barely match. The gates stood open in eternal invitation, their bronze surfaces green with patina, but unmarked by the decay that should have claimed any structure abandoned for centuries, while beyond the entrance lay streets that wound between buildings whose architecture blended human practicality with vampiric aesthetics in ways that created harmony instead of the jarring contrasts that marked most attempts at cross-species collaboration. Gardens had grown wild in the centuries since the Citadel's abandonment, but their wildness followed patterns that suggested deliberate design rather than random neglect. Flowering vines climbing walls according to plans that created beauty from apparent chaos, while fountains continued running with crystal-clear water that defied any explanation based on normal hydraulic principles. The moment they crossed the threshold into Valthorn proper, each member of their group felt the weight of ancient magic settling around them, like invisible chains that bound them to the Citadel's fate, while simultaneously offering protection against external threats that would have overwhelmed any purely physical defense. Victor recognized the sensation from his youth when he had visited the Citadel during its golden age. The binding magic that ensured no one could enter with hostile intent, while preventing anyone from leaving until they had fulfilled whatever purpose had drawn them to this sanctuary between worlds. Mara experienced the binding as a gentle but implacable pressure that made the idea of departure feel not forbidden, but simply irrelevant, as if the citadel itself was convincing her that everything she needed could be found within its walls, while everything she feared existed only in the world beyond its protective embrace. Marcus fought against the mental influence with training that had been specifically designed to resist supernatural manipulation, but found his resistance crumbling against magic that worked through invitation rather than compulsion, offering partnership instead of demanding submission. Luna responded to Valethorn with the delight of someone coming home after a long journey through foreign lands, her infant awareness somehow recognizing the citadel as the place where her heritage had first taken root in the form of hybrid children who had once run through these same streets without fear of persecution or misunderstanding. The buildings around them bore the architectural signatures of both human and vampire craftsmanship, their design principles creating structures that accommodated the needs of beings who required both sunlight and shadow, warmth and coolness, the bustle of daily life, and the contemplative silence that immortal existence sometimes demanded. Victor moved through familiar streets, with the careful reverence of someone visiting a graveyard where beloved friends lay buried beneath stones that marked not just individual deaths, but the end of an entire way of life that had promised so much before fear and prejudice destroyed it in blood and fire. The spectral inhabitants of Valethorn materialized gradually as the afternoon shadows lengthened, their forms becoming more solid and defined as the boundary between day and night blurred into the twilight hours when supernatural energies flowed most freely through the citadel's ancient stones. These spirits bore the faces and forms of humans and vampires, who had died defending their shared home against the forces that sought to destroy any evidence that cooperation between species was not only possible but profitable for everyone involved, their sacrifice ensuring that Valethorn itself survived even if its living population did not. Victor recognized faces from his youth among the spectral defenders, friends and allies whose deaths he had mourned for centuries while carrying the guilt of survival that had colored every decision he made in the years following the genocide that ended the Golden Age. The spirits showed no resentment toward him. Their posthumous existence focused not on past failures, but on future possibilities that Luna's presence in their sanctuary had suddenly made achievable once again. Through mirrors of polished obsidian that reflected more than mere physical appearance, the spirits shared visions of Valethorn's past that revealed the true scope of what had been lost when fear conquered wisdom and prejudice triumphed over understanding. Luna watched these historical panoramas with the intense focus of someone whose heritage was being unveiled for the first time, her hybrid nature allowing her to perceive details and nuances that would have been lost on purely human or vampire observers. The visions showed hybrid children playing in gardens that bloomed with impossible beauty, their laughter echoing through streets where human merchants traded peacefully with vampire artisans, while scholars from both species collaborated on projects that advanced knowledge beyond what either group could have achieved alone. Mara saw in these images a glimpse of the future that Luna might help create, a world where her daughter's unique nature would be celebrated rather than feared, while Marcus witnessed evidence that challenged everything he had believed about vampire-human relations. The spirits served as both guardians and teachers, their accumulated wisdom providing guidance that helped Luna understand the full scope of her heritage while offering protection against the psychic attacks that were already beginning to probe the Citadel's defenses as Elisara's forces gathered in the valleys below. Victor found himself confronting aspects of his own past that he had tried to forget, the spirits forcing him to acknowledge his role in perpetuating the cycle of hatred that had kept the species apart for centuries after the genocide ended any hope of immediate reconciliation. Through their patient instruction, he began to understand that redemption was possible not through dwelling on past failures, but through commitment to ensuring that Luna's generation would have opportunities that had been denied to the hybrid children who died in the original purge. The siege of Valethorn began with supernatural warfare that made their previous encounters seem like minor skirmishes in comparison to the full assault that Elisara had marshaled against the Citadel that represented everything she sought to prevent from returning to the world. Her army combined traditional vampire forces with werewolf mercenaries whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of territory and hunting rights, while corrupted humans served as expendable shock troops whose minds had been twisted by supernatural influence until they viewed their own species as enemies to be eliminated, rather than allies to be protected. Shadow creatures that existed primarily in dimensions adjacent to normal reality scaled the citadel walls with liquid grace that defied both gravity and geometry, their forms shifting between solid and ethereal states that made them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons, while allowing them to pass through physical barriers that should have stopped any material threat. Enchanted siege engines hurled bolts of concentrated dark energy that exploded against the Citadel's magical defenses with impact forces that would have leveled ordinary fortifications, each strike testing the limits of protective spells that had been woven into Valethorn's very foundations during its construction centuries ago. The psychological warfare that accompanied the physical assault proved equally dangerous, as Elisara's forces projected waves of despair and madness, designed to break the defenders' will to resist before their bodies were overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Victor coordinated the citadel's defense with tactics that drew upon both his military experience and his knowledge of Veilthorn's hidden capabilities, while Marcus found himself working alongside vampire defenders, whose courage and dedication challenged his remaining prejudices about their species' inherent nature. Luna's rapid development accelerated under the pressure of siege conditions, her hybrid abilities manifesting new capabilities that exceeded even Zelda's most optimistic predictions about her potential growth rate. She demonstrated the ability to see through illusions that would have deceived much more experienced supernatural beings, her perception cutting through layers of deception to reveal the true nature of threats that approached the citadel from directions that normal senses could not detect. Her communication with the spectral defenders provided intelligence about enemy movements that proved invaluable in coordinating defensive strategies, while her ability to project shields of pure light offered protection against dark energy attacks that would have penetrated conventional magical barriers. Mara watched her daughter's transformation with equal measures of pride and concern, amazed by Luna's rapid advancement, while worried about the psychological effects of developing such power at an age when most children were still learning basic motor skills. The first day of siege ended with Veilthorn's outer defenses breached, but its inner sanctum still secure behind layers of protection that combined ancient magic with the desperate determination of defenders who understood that defeat meant not just their own destruction, but the end of any hope for reconciliation between species that had been enemies for far too long. Victor surveyed damage that would have been catastrophic for any ordinary fortification while calculating how long their remaining defenses could withstand assault from forces that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker, despite the casualties they had suffered during their initial attacks. The spectral defenders reported that Elisara was preparing new tactics for the next phase of her campaign. Her centuries of experience in siege warfare, providing her with knowledge of vulnerabilities that even Veilthorn's builders might not have anticipated when they designed protections against threats that seemed adequate for their own era, but which were being tested by enemies whose capabilities had evolved over the intervening centuries. Luna slept peacefully in the citadel's central chamber, despite the ongoing bombardment, her infant dreams filled with visions that the spirits shared of possible futures where her nature served as a bridge rather than a barrier between worlds that had forgotten how to coexist, while her guardians prepared for battles that would determine whether those visions remained fantasies or became foundations for a new golden age built on understanding rather than fear, cooperation rather than conquest, and hope rather than the hatred that had defined supernatural politics since the day the first hybrid child died, screaming in the flames of genocide that still burned in the memories of all who had survived to witness Luna's arrival in a world desperate for redemption. The transformation that overtook Luna during the siege's second night defied every understanding of natural development that even supernatural beings possessed, her infant form aging rapidly into that of a young child while retaining the innocent wonder and pure perspective that had characterized her earliest days of life. Victor watched in amazement as her features refined themselves into those of a girl who appeared perhaps 5 years old, despite having been born mere months ago, her silver eyes gaining depth and intelligence that suggested wisdom far beyond her apparent age, while her physical capabilities expanded to match powers that were manifesting with breathtaking speed and complexity. The aging process seemed to follow rules that prioritized function over time, granting Luna the physical and mental development necessary to consciously control abilities that had previously operated purely through instinct, while preserving the essential innocence that made her powers forces of healing rather than destruction. Her newly awakened abilities revealed themselves through acts of compassion that transformed the Citadel's desperate defense into something approaching hope. Her touch healing wounds that conventional medicine could never have addressed, while her expanded perception allowed her to see into the hearts of defenders and attackers alike, judging their true intentions with clarity that cut through deception and self-delusion to reveal the core motivations that drove their actions. Victor witnessed her channel energy that affected both living and undead with equal efficacy, her hybrid nature allowing her to work with life forces that existed across the spectrum of mortality and immortality, bridging gaps that had previously seemed impossible to cross. The ancient spirits of Veilthorn gathered around Luna with reverence that spoke to her fulfillment of prophecies they had spent centuries guarding, their spectral forms growing more solid and defined in her presence, as if her power somehow anchored them more firmly to the material world. Between these intimate moments of discovery, the siege raged with intensity that tested every defensive capability Veilthorn possessed. Massive battle scenes unfolding across the citadel's walls and courtyards where defenders fought with the desperate courage of those who understood that defeat meant not just their own destruction, but the end of any possibility for the peaceful future that Luna represented. Victor coordinated defensive strategies that drew upon centuries of military experience, while adapting to his growing realization that Luna was becoming what Seraphina's children could have been if they had been allowed to mature and develop their abilities, rather than being slaughtered in their infancy by those who feared what they might become. The comparison filled him with both wonder at what Luna might achieve and renewed grief for the potential that had been lost when the original hybrid bloodline was nearly exterminated. Ancient wards that had protected Veilthorn since its founding began showing signs of failure under the Council's relentless assault, their magical energies depleting at rates that suggested the Citadel's defenses had perhaps days, rather than weeks, before they would collapse entirely and leave the sanctuary vulnerable to forces that had grown stronger and more desperate with each unsuccessful attempt to breach the inner sanctum. Marcus found himself fighting alongside spectral warriors whose courage and dedication had impressed him beyond his ability to maintain his prejudices against supernatural beings, while Mara divided her attention between supporting the defense and helping Luna understand powers that were developing faster than any instruction could adequately guide. The battle's ebb and flow created moments of terrible intensity, followed by brief respites that allowed defenders to tend wounds and prepare for the next wave of attacks that seemed designed to wear down their resistance through sheer persistence rather than overwhelming force. Elisara's penetration of the inner sanctum came not through brute force, but through treachery that exploited the very compassion that made Veilthorn a sanctuary rather than merely a fortress. Her centuries of experience in psychological manipulation, allowing her to possess one of the defending spirits and use its trusted status to bypass magical defenses that had been designed to repel external threats rather than internal betrayal. The possessed spirit moved through the Citadel's heart with access that no physical infiltrator could have achieved, its spectral nature allowing passage through barriers that would have stopped any material form, while its apparent loyalty prevented other defenders from recognizing the danger until Elisara had already reached the chamber where Seraphina once held court, and where her tomb now stood as a monument to what had been lost when fear triumphed over wisdom. The confrontation between Victor and Elisara in Seraphina's memorial chamber became deeply personal, as centuries of unspoken history erupted into accusations and revelations that transformed their conflict from a battle over Luna's fate into a reckoning with shared guilt over the genocide that had destroyed their world and driven them apart, despite bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. Elisara's revelation that they had been lovers before Victor's guilt over his failure to prevent the slaughter drove him into exile added layers of tragedy to their opposition. Her belief that killing Luna would free them both from the burden of past failures, revealing the depth of her own pain, while demonstrating how differently they had processed the trauma of witnessing an entire way of life destroyed by hatred and fear. The chamber around them seemed to pulse with memories of better times, when Seraphina's wisdom had guided both species toward cooperation that benefited everyone involved. The preserved artifacts of human-vampire collaboration, serving as silent witnesses to what they had all lost when paradise collapsed into genocide. Victor fought with skills honed by centuries of combat experience while struggling against emotional turmoil that made every exchange of blows a reminder of what they had shared before the world changed and forced them into opposition. His vampiric strength and speed, matched against Elisara's equally formidable abilities in a duel that would have been magnificent to witness if the stakes had been anything less than the future of supernatural civilization. Their battle ranged across the memorial chamber with destructive force that cracked ancient stones and sent priceless relics crashing to the floor. Each combatant seeking advantages that their intimate knowledge of the other's fighting style made difficult to achieve, while around them the sounds of Marcus and Mara fighting against the Countess's remaining forces provided a backdrop of desperate violence that reminded them both how much depended on the outcome of their personal conflict. The climactic moment arrived when Victor's strength finally failed under the accumulated damage of prolonged combat, leaving him wounded and vulnerable, while Elisara held a blade to Luna's throat with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from the magnitude of the choice she was about to make. Her final bargain offered Victor a return to the old order, where vampire supremacy would be rebuilt on foundations of fear and domination rather than cooperation. The price being his abandonment of Luna and everything the child represented in terms of hope for a different future than the endless cycle of violence that had defined supernatural politics since the genocide ended any possibility of immediate reconciliation between species that had once lived in harmony. Luna's understanding of the choice being made for her transcended her apparent age and spoke to wisdom that seemed to flow from her hybrid nature rather than from experience she had not yet had time to accumulate, her response revealing depths of compassion and strategic thinking that surprised even those who had watched her rapid development with amazement. Instead of waiting passively for rescue or attempting to escape through displays of power that might have harmed innocent defenders, she chose to use her abilities not as weapons, but as instruments of revelation, channeling her unique perspective to show Elisara visions of what the world could become if fear was replaced by understanding and the cycle of violence finally broken through conscious choice rather than exhausted stalemate. The vision that Luna projected into Elisara's consciousness revealed futures where vampires and humans worked together on projects that advanced both civilizations beyond what either could achieve alone, where hybrid children played in gardens without fear of persecution, while their parents collaborated on solving problems that had plagued both species for centuries, where the wisdom that Serafina had tried to establish became the foundation for lasting peace that honored the needs and contributions of all supernatural beings, rather than privileging one group at the expense of others. The beauty of these possible futures overwhelmed Elisara with recognition of what had been lost, not through inevitable conflict, but through choices, made in fear and maintained through stubborn refusal to consider alternatives that required trust instead of domination. In the moment of redemption that followed her exposure to Luna's vision of possibility, Elisara faced the full weight of her own role in perpetuating cycles of hatred that had prevented healing and reconciliation for far longer than was necessary. Her recognition of the damage she had caused and continued to cause through her insistence on maintaining old patterns of supremacy and revenge, creating an opportunity for transformation that required courage equal to any physical battle she had ever fought. The choice to release Luna and turn the blade on herself represented not surrender, but victory over the part of her nature that had chosen destruction over creation, hatred over love, and fear over the hope that Luna embodied simply by existing as proof that cooperation between species was not only possible, but could produce something greater than either could achieve separately. Elisara's final act broke the siege not through violence, but through the power of example, her willingness to end her own role in perpetuating hatred rather than destroy hope for the future, sending shockwaves through the attacking forces that had followed her leadership without fully understanding the depths of her obsession with preventing any return to the golden age that had ended in genocide. Victor watched his former lover choose redemption over revenge with emotions too complex for words, her sacrifice creating space for the very future she had tried to prevent, while freeing him from guilt that had shaped every decision he had made since the day he failed to save the first generation of hybrid children from those who feared what they represented. Luna stood in the aftermath of Elisara's choice with understanding that transcended her apparent years, her hybrid nature allowing her to perceive the significance of what had occurred, while her innocent perspective maintained hope that such moments of transformation could become more common as the world learned to see cooperation as strength rather than weakness, difference as opportunity rather than threat, and the future as something to be created through conscious choice rather than something to be endured as the inevitable result of past failures and present fears. With Elisara's death breaking the siege and scattering her forces like leaves before a hurricane, the surviving members of the council found themselves facing a choice that would define not only their own futures, but the trajectory of supernatural civilization for generations to come. Their decision between continuing the old ways of supremacy and fear, or accepting Luna as a living symbol of what cooperation between species might achieve, carrying implications that extended far beyond the immediate political ramifications of their ancient enemy's dramatic transformation and sacrifice. Valthorn bore the scars of battle across its ancient walls and courtyards, but the citadel's essential structure remained intact, while something more significant had changed in the aftermath of Elisara's final act of redemption, the spirits of its former inhabitants finally finding the peace that had eluded them for centuries, as their purpose in protecting and preserving hope for reconciliation was fulfilled through Luna's survival, and the demonstration that even the most committed opponents of change could choose transformation when confronted with visions of what the world could become. Luna herself had emerged from the conflict with the physical appearance of a 5-year-old child whose wisdom and compassion transcended anything that normal development could explain. Her hybrid nature allowing her to perceive the deeper currents of emotion and intention that flowed beneath surface interactions, while her innocent perspective maintained the optimism necessary to begin the slow work of healing wounds that had festered for centuries between communities that had forgotten how to trust each other. The work of reconciliation began with small gestures and tentative overtures that gradually expanded into formal diplomatic initiatives as Victor reached out to moderate vampires whose centuries of existence had left them weary of endless conflict and interested in exploring alternatives to the cycle of violence that had defined supernatural politics since the genocide ended any hope of immediate peace between species whose differences had been weaponized by those who profited from division. Marcus found himself in the unexpected position of serving as a bridge between human governmental agencies and supernatural communities that had operated in shadows for so long that most officials barely acknowledged their existence. His unique experience and hard-won understanding of vampire psychology, making him invaluable in establishing diplomatic channels that could handle negotiations requiring sensitivity to concerns and perspectives that fell outside normal human experience. Mara watched her daughter take on responsibilities that would have challenged adults with decades of experience in mediation and conflict resolution. Luna's natural ability to see through deception and perceive the genuine motivations behind stated positions, making her an unexpectedly effective facilitator for discussions that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of centuries-old grievances and mutual suspicion. 6 months after the siege ended, Valethorn had transformed from a battlefield into a neutral meeting ground, where representatives from both species attempted to work through centuries of accumulated mistrust and resentment, while establishing frameworks for cooperation that could address practical concerns about territory, resources, and jurisdiction, without requiring either side to abandon essential aspects of their nature or cultural identity. Luna's role as an innocent mediator proved crucial in these delicate negotiations, her very existence serving as proof that cooperation between humans and vampires was not only possible, but could produce something greater than either species could achieve separately, while her ability to detect deception and ulterior motives helped maintain honesty in discussions where centuries of habit encouraged manipulation and strategic positioning rather than genuine communication. The early victories were small, but significant. A vampire physician who had spent centuries studying supernatural diseases began collaborating with human colleagues on research that promised benefits for both communities. Mixed neighborhoods started forming in urban areas where progressive members of both species chose integration over segregation, and new legislation began emerging that protected the rights and acknowledged the unique needs of supernatural citizens while maintaining security for human populations who had legitimate concerns about the potential dangers of closer contact. Change proceeded slowly and faced resistance from conservative factions on both sides, who viewed any compromise as betrayal of fundamental principles that had sustained their communities through centuries of conflict, ensuring that the future would bring challenges as entrenched interests worked to undermine progress that threatened their power and privileged positions within existing hierarchies. Victor found himself navigating complex political currents as he worked to build coalitions of vampires willing to support peaceful coexistence while maintaining credibility with traditionalists who viewed his association with humans as evidence of weakness or corruption that disqualified him from leadership roles within supernatural society. His relationship with Mara deepened into genuine love that transcended the initial circumstances of their meeting. But their growing emotional connection was complicated by the fundamental realities of her mortal nature and his eternal existence, creating questions about the future that neither could answer with confidence, despite their commitment to exploring whatever possibilities their unconventional partnership might offer. Luna's accelerated development continued to manifest in ways that suggested she would reach full maturity of her hybrid powers within years, rather than the decades that normal supernatural development typically required. Her rapid growth, both physical and mental, creating opportunities for her to assume greater responsibilities in the reconciliation process, while raising concerns about the psychological effects of such compressed experience on a being whose emotional development needed time to catch up with her expanding capabilities. The special school established in the rebuilt section of Velthorn, that became known as New Velthorn, served as a practical laboratory for integration where human and vampire children learned together in ways that had seemed impossible mere months before, their natural acceptance of difference demonstrating that prejudice was learned rather than instinctive, while their friendships across species lines provided hope that future generations might avoid the conflicts that had defined their parents' experiences. 2 years after Luna's birth, found her with the appearance of a child of 7 or 8, attending classes in New Veilthorn alongside students whose diverse backgrounds included both human families seeking progressive education and vampire clans willing to experiment with integration in controlled environments that minimized risks while maximizing opportunities for positive contact between communities that had been isolated from each other for far too long. Her classmates treated her hybrid nature as simply another form of diversity, rather than something to be feared or worshipped, their casual acceptance providing Luna with the normal childhood experiences that her unique circumstances might otherwise have prevented, while demonstrating that cooperation between species was not only possible but natural, when fear and prejudice were not deliberately cultivated by those who profited from division. Mara had evolved from a frightened mother protecting her unusual child into a confident ambassador, helping other mixed families navigate the challenges and opportunities of a changing world where supernatural beings were slowly emerging from hiding into greater integration with human society. Her experience with Luna, providing insights that proved invaluable in counseling parents whose children exhibited supernatural traits that previous generations would have hidden or suppressed. Victor's transformation from an ancient killer haunted by centuries of violence into a protector of life who led a reformed council dedicated to integration rather than supremacy, represented one of the most dramatic character developments in the ongoing saga of supernatural politics. His credibility with traditional vampire society, combined with his commitment to change, making him uniquely qualified to guide his species through transitions that required abandoning comfortable certainties in favor of uncertain but promising possibilities. Marcus directed a joint human-vampire security force that approached supernatural crimes with understanding, rather than the prejudice and fear that had characterized previous law enforcement responses to incidents involving beings whose nature and capabilities fell outside normal human experience. His team's success in reducing both supernatural violence and human victimization, demonstrating that cooperation could produce practical benefits that served everyone's interests, while challenging assumptions about the inevitability of conflict between species with different needs and perspectives. The garden where Luna played had been designed to accommodate both night-blooming flowers that vampires found beautiful and day-blooming varieties that humans enjoyed, their different cycles and requirements creating unexpected harmonies that produced beauty neither could achieve alone, while serving as a living metaphor for the kind of cooperation that their community was working to establish on a larger scale. The sound of Luna's laughter no longer shattered windows, as her control over her hybrid abilities had developed to the point where she could express joy without causing unintended damage, the music of her happiness bringing pleasure to all who heard it, rather than the fear and confusion that had marked her earliest days when her nature was unknown and her potential seemed more threatening than promising. Mara's reflection on the journey from that silent hospital room, where Luna's birth had seemed like a crisis to be managed rather than a miracle to be celebrated, encompassed not just her own transformation, but the broader changes that had begun with one child's arrival and spread through ripple effects that touch communities on both sides of the supernatural divide. Luna's eyes retained their ability to shift between human brown and vampire silver depending on her emotional state and the nature of her activities, their changing colors serving as a visible reminder of her dual heritage while symbolizing the possibility that differences could coexist and even enhance each other, rather than inevitably leading to conflict and mutual destruction. Her first words, directed beyond the immediate circle of family and friends, carried a message of hope that transcended her apparent age and spoke to wisdom that seemed to flow from her hybrid nature, rather than from experience she had not yet had time to accumulate. Her observation that every ending represented a new beginning waiting to be born, offering perspective that reframed loss and change as opportunities rather than merely challenges to be endured. Victor's approach through the twilight of a day that no longer filled him with the dread that had characterized centuries of existence, spent hiding from sunlight, demonstrated his own transformation from someone who feared the dawn to someone who could appreciate the beauty of transitions between day and night, light and shadow, different states of being that could complement rather than threaten each other when fear was replaced by understanding and cooperation substituted for conflict. The prospect of whatever challenges tomorrow might bring no longer seemed overwhelming when faced by an unconventional family whose bonds had been forged in crisis and strengthened through shared commitment to creating a better world for Luna and all the children whose futures would be shaped by the choices made during these crucial early years of supernatural integration. 10 years in the future revealed Luna as a young woman whose election as the first leader of the Interspecies Council represented the fulfillment of potential that had been evident from her birth, but which required a decade of careful development and gradual social change to reach fruition in a world that had transformed dramatically from the one into which she had been born. The integrated communities that now thrived across the globe demonstrated that cooperation between humans and vampires could produce benefits that served everyone's interests, while the medical advances that emerged from collaboration between species with different biological capabilities offered hope for addressing challenges that had previously seemed insurmountable. The old fears had largely given way to mutual respect based on understanding rather than ignorance, though the transformation remained incomplete and required ongoing effort to maintain progress against the constant pressure of those who preferred familiar patterns of conflict to uncertain possibilities of peace. Mara and Victor's love had endured the tests of time and circumstance, with Mara choosing to accept the gift of extended life that would allow her to remain with her supernatural family rather than accepting the natural limits of human mortality that would have separated them after mere decades together. Her decision representing not just personal choice, but symbolic acceptance of the kind of integration that their daughter had made possible through her very existence. The historic treaty that Luna signed as leader of the Interspecies Council used ink mixed from human blood freely given and vampire essence willingly shared. The symbolic mixture representing the unity that had grown from her hybrid nature, while demonstrating that cooperation could be formalized in ways that honored the contributions and sacrifices of both species in creating a world where difference was celebrated rather than feared.